Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I intend to contribute to the panel on languages, cultures, and education by briefly revisiting the language policy and language education situation in Mozambique. The title of my paper is Language Education in Mozambique. In fact, a first draft of this paper was presented at the UNESCO African Conference on Humanities held in Bamako, Mali, from the 28th of June to the 1st of July 2017. Similarly to many other countries in Africa, multilingualism and linguistic diversity characterize Mozambique, a country that hosts over 20 languages, most of which of the Bantu language family. In addition to the Bantu languages, which actually work as cross-border languages shared with neighboring countries in Southern Africa, other languages spoken in the country include Arabic as well as Chinese and Asiatic languages. Despite existing multilingualism, at the time of the country's independence in 1975, Portuguese was chosen as the only official language in the country. As such, Portuguese became the sole medium of instruction and the main vehicle for state administration. This, in spite of the fact that at the time of independence, less than 10% of the people were able to speak this language. The adoption of former colonial languages as official languages has been common practice in many independent countries in Africa. In our case, the main reason for the choice of the ex-colonizers' languages at the expense of the local Mozambican languages was the difficulty of selecting only one language amidst the mosaic of languages present. In addition, Portuguese, although spoken by a small minority of Mozambicans at independence, was seen as not marked either regionally or ethnically, and above all, it was known by the elites, especially those that had been through the colonial education system. Portuguese was certainly a politically neutral language in the country, spoken by a very small percentage of Mozambicans, but which would serve well the purposes of nation building. The view of multilingualism or language diversity as a problem was certainly present in post-independent Mozambique. The vision of a multilingual Mozambique was out of the political agenda. The key goal at the time was to urgently build the Mozambican nation and make it work as such. The fact that there were so many languages spoken by the various ethnic groups constituting the new republic, and the fact that none of them was spoken nationwide as a lingua franca, would probably have constituted a hindrance to the birth of the new nation. I often recall Christopher Stroud, 1999, in his quote that says, "The language of the oppression during the colonial times was appropriated by Frelimo movement. Its ownership was challenged, its alliances were reconceived, and its boundaries were redrawn. The language was, to all its intents and purposes, symbolically taken and subsequently transformed into a weapon of the revolution." Therefore, the choice of Portuguese as Mozambique's only official language was to a great extent justified by fears of tribal and ethnic conflicts, and that could likely emerge if any one of the national languages had been chosen instead. As a result of its adoption as the only official language, and thus its connection to the job and the formal labor market, including both the public and the private sectors, and its exclusive use in the education system, the Portuguese language has enjoyed very high status and prestige. It is a language seen as the key to academic, social, professional, and economic ascension. It is valued by the social and political elites and equally by the masses. The next point I would like to tackle has to do with the language education. With Portuguese instituted as the only official language, the first language education policy of the post-independent Mozambique is characterized by Portuguese being the main and exclusive vehicle and tool for building literacy skills at all levels of education. This was the case from 1975 up until the early 90s, when as a result of arguments on language exclusion and its disadvantage, for the first time ever, the Mozambican languages were allowed and introduced in the school context under the umbrella of the Mother Tongue Bilingual Education Pilot Project. When discussing language education in Mozambique, it's important to mention the existence of two different and concurrent language education policies being implemented, one for the schools in rural areas and the second one for urban schools. It should be said that the urban school has mainly a monolingual language education policy, where Portuguese still reigns supreme. On the other hand, the Mozambican rural school has a bilingual language education policy, which consists of students L1, one of the Mozambican languages, and Portuguese being the L2. Mother tongue education was introduced in 1993, making the end to the exclusive use of Portuguese as the only medium of instruction in the country. The main aims of the bilingual education program were to contribute to the improvement of the quality of basic education, acknowledging that Portuguese is not the mother tongue of the majority of Mozambicans. Its introduction was supported by international research and practice, pointing to the academic and cognitive advantages of the use of the mother tongue in initial schooling. Mother tongue education in Mozambique, although perceived as a welcome initiative by those directly affected, especially people in rural areas, also raises questions as to whether resources should not be well spent on improving the quality of Portuguese language teaching and learning. Although such doubts exist, there seems to be a perceived awareness of the benefits of mother tongue education, which is in fact confirmed by parents in rural areas. An evaluation of bilingual education program, for instance, points out to a number of positive outcomes emerging as a direct consequence of the introduction of mother tongue-based education. Among them, the increasing levels of student participation in the classroom, self-confidence, and higher levels of teacher-learner interaction. So, where do we stand now? As a way of conclusion, I would like to leave you with a number of issues for reflection. Among them, the following. How can we make sure that existing differences of conditions in the implementation of both policies are not likely to raise different attitudes and doubts in relation to the effectiveness of mother tongue education, especially because differences are already observable in terms of availability of materials, students' textbooks, and teachers' manuals, as well as the preparedness of teachers to intervene in bilingual education. How can the early transition bilingual education model that was adopted which is mainly characterized as a weak form of bilingualism, result in balanced bilinguals? And finally, what can we as language and education planners do in order to design a plural language education policy which caters for the need to master modern European languages as well as African languages alike because of the perceived benefits at the academic, professional, and social levels? Ladies and gentlemen, this is what I would like to share with you, and thank you very much for your attention.